Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental to how we understand learning. The connection between educational psychology, how we learn in practice in cognitive neuroscience, what's happening in our brains while we learn.
Exactly. We've got some, really fascinating material that looks at how these two fields currently talk to each other, and maybe more importantly, how they could be working together much more effectively.
And for you, our listener, who wants to get a solid grasp of important ideas without getting lost in the weeds, well, that's exactly our aim. We'll unpack the core arguments, point out some surprising angles, and keep the conversation engaging.
Our mission today is to really get to the heart of why a two-way collaboration between these fields is just so vital. We want to explore why looking at learning and the brain from different perspectives, what they call levels of analysis, can unlock deeper understanding.
Yeah, and guiding us through this is the work of Virginia W. Berninger and David Carina from the University of Washington. Their paper offers a pretty compelling framework for how we should be thinking about this relationship.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The initial thinking, way back in the 80s with Whitrock, was largely about educational psychology needing to pay attention to the breakthroughs happening in brain science.
Right, how they apply to learning.
Exactly, and how they applied to learning. It was a push for educators to become more informed by what neuroscience was discovering about the brain.
Hmm.
But Berninger and Carina are proposing a much more dynamic relationship. They argue for a bidirectional collaboration, so it's not just a one-way street where education takes findings from neuroscience.
Which they mentioned was a view held by researchers like Burns and Fox, right?
Yes, precisely. The crucial shift here, though, is recognizing that educational psychology isn't just a passive recipient. It holds a wealth of insights that can actually, inform and guide cognitive neuroscience research.
That makes sense. I mean, think about it. Educational psychologists are the experts in understanding complex cognitive functions like reading, writing, problem solving. And they're the ones designing and testing different teaching methods.
Totally. And what's fascinating here is imagining how the detailed observations of learning processes, the stuff educational psychologists see every day, could lead to very specific questions for brain imaging studies.
Ah, okay. So, like, seeing a teaching method work well and then using neuroscience to figure out why it works on a brain level?
Exactly. This could really help us pinpoint the neural mechanisms underlying effective teaching strategies. For instance, an educational psychologist might notice a specific reading intervention is, super successful. That observation could then drive an fMRI study to investigate the specific brain changes happening because of that intervention.
Now, this isn't just theory, right? Berninger and Carina actually point to the Multidisciplinary Learning Disabilities Center at the University of Washington as a real-world example.
Yeah, that's their place. They've got researchers from education, psychology, and even the medical school all working together. It's a genuine two-way street in action.
That's pretty cool.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this UWLD Center is actually part of a larger national effort. It's one of 5 centers funded by the NIH, specifically focused on using brain imaging to understand learning disabilities better.
Oh, wow. So who are the others?
The other big research hubs doing similar work are at Yale, the University of Colorado, Johns Hopkins, and Harvard. So yeah, this idea of bringing these fields together to tackle learning challenges is clearly a priority at a very high level.
Okay, so this call for a two-way collaboration, it really makes a lot of sense. Now let's dig into this idea of levels of analysis, because it sounds like this is a key part of understanding how these fields can best inform each other.
Absolutely. Berninger and Carina stress that when we study the brain, whether we're looking at its structure or how it functions, we can do so at many different scales.
Scales.
Like from the microscopic level of molecules and individual neurons, all the way up to the macroscopic level of large brain regions, the lobes, hemispheres, that sort of thing. They even provide a helpful table mapping out these different levels.
And the critical point here, I guess, is that understanding what's happening at one level doesn't automatically explain what's happening in another. It's not just simple cause and effect.
Not at all. It's not a simple one-to-one relationship. Knowing how a single neuron fires, for instance, doesn't directly tell you how different brain regions are coordinating during something complex, like reading.
Right.
And it's important to keep in mind that the functional brain imaging tech, we use most widely now, like fMRI, primarily operates at that macro level.
So it shows the big picture, like which areas are active.
Exactly. Because fMRI detects blood flow changes as a kind of proxy for neural activity, it gives us a broad picture of what brain regions are active. But, it doesn't show us the intricate firing patterns of individual neurons.
Which is probably crucial for the fine details of learning, yeah.
Definitely. And we're not yet at a stage where we can easily observe that micro-level activity during, say, typical classroom learning.
Okay, that makes sense. But it gets even more intricate, doesn't it? Because they also bring in the social context.
Yes. They highlight the concept of brain-to-brain interactions, citing Cacioppo and Bernstein as another crucial level of analysis. Learning so often happens in social settings, right?
Yeah, interacting with teachers, peers.
And our brains are interacting with each other in ways we're only just beginning to understand. It raises this really important question. How do we account for the fact that the brain isn't just an isolated processor?
It's constantly interacting with the environment.
Exactly. And a huge part of that environment is other people, other brains. So the brain is both the driver of our learning and it's shaped by the learning experiences it undergoes. It's this constant feedback loop.
Okay, so this framework of levels of analysis, Berninger and Karina use it to look at specific research areas. They start with reading, and they challenge a specific idea.
Yeah, they challenge the notion that only one model of reading, Adams's from 1990, is truly consistent with what we know about the brain.
Ah, okay. They think others fit too.
Yes, they argue that several other well-regarded models of reading development also fit the evidence. They specifically mention Hind and Hind, McClelland et al., Posner et al., Peterson et al., and Seidenberg and McClelland.
It's quite a list.
It is. And what's so insightful here is how these different models align with brain research that's happening at different levels of analysis.
Okay, let's break that down. Maybe start with Hind and Hind. What level are they looking at?
So the Hind and Hind model focuses on the sequence of neural pathways, like the visual info coming in through the occipital lobe, moving to the angular gyrus, then Wernicke's for understanding, and finally Broca's for producing language.
Okay, so that's very anatomical, like the physical roads the information takes in the brain. For someone listening, this sequential view highlights how different brain bits have specific jobs in handling words.
Right. Then you have models like those from Posner et al. And Peterson et al., which came out of P.E. Channing's studies. These models emphasize the specific locations in the brain where metabolic activity increases during reading.
So less about the pathway, more about the hotspots.
Kind of. They even suggested there might be alternative ways the brain can process written info, not just one fixed pathway, more flexible.
Interesting. And then the connectionist models, McClelland, Seidenberg, those sound more computational.
They are. They're looking at a more computational level. These models focus on how the brain might process information through interconnected networks, simulating how we move from seeing the letters, the orthography, to understanding the sound, the phonology.
Talk about those hidden layers. What are those supposed to represent?
Well, those hidden layers are sort of like intermediate steps in processing information, kind of like how a complex idea gets broken down into simpler parts before we fully grasp it. They simulate the association areas in the brain, doing the complex computations between input and output.
Got it. So the key takeaway here is that these different reading models aren't necessarily fighting each other.
Exactly. They're offering different perspectives on the same process because they're focused on different levels of analysis, the physical pathways, the active brain regions, the underlying computations.
So they could all be like partially right, just looking at different facets?
Potentially, yes. They could all be providing valid insights within their own frameworks. It really highlights just how complex reading actually is when you examine it through these different lenses.
It really does. Okay, so moving from reading, Berninger and Karina also use this levels idea to look at deafness and American Sign Language, right?
Absolutely. And this is a fascinating area because studying deaf individuals, particularly those who learn sign language from birth, gives us this unique window.
To see how environment learning of visual language and biology, our brain's structure interact.
Precisely, how they interact to shape learning and development. What's particularly revealing is comparing how the brain processes a visual language like ASL versus a written language like English.
And they looked at this in both deaf native signers and hearing people who also know ASL.
Yes, exactly. They discussed several fMRI studies investigating this. And one of the key findings is that the left hemisphere, which we typically link with language and hearing folks,
Is also heavily involved in sign language processing in deaf signers. areas like Broca's and Wernicke's.
That's right, which suggests there might be a fundamental biological predisposition for these left brain regions to handle complex language, whether it's spoken or signed. For listeners, this shows the brain's remarkable flexibility, adapting its inherent language tools for different forms of communication.
Okay, but there was a twist, wasn't there? Something about the right hemisphere.
Yes, this is where it gets really interesting. These fMRI studies also showed significant activity in the right hemisphere in both deaf and hearing native signers when they were processing ASL.
Both groups. So it's not just about being deaf.
Apparently not. It was particularly noticeable in areas of the posterior parietal and superior temporal lobes. Researchers guess it might be related to the visual spatial nature of sign language itself.
That makes sense. ASL involves space and movement a lot.
Totally. Relying heavily on visual cues and movements in space, it really underscores how the brain can recruit different regions depending on the specific demands of the task.
So fMRI shows this broader activity.
Yeah.
But what about other types of studies, like looking at people with brain damage?
Right. So if we compare these fMRI findings with studies of deaf signers who've had brain damage lesion studies, we get a slightly different picture. Damage to the left hemisphere in deaf signers often leads to significant sign language problems, similar to aphasia in hearing individuals after left hemisphere strokes.
So even though the right side lights up in fMRI, the left side seems necessary.
It might suggest that yes. While fMRI shows activity in both hemispheres under normal conditions, those left hemisphere regions seem essential for language processing, regardless of modality.
So again, different levels of analysis, functional imaging versus lesion studies, give us complementary but not identical information.
Exactly. And the picture gets even more complex when they looked at how deaf native signers process written English. Compared to hearing individuals, they showed a different pattern of brain activation.
Different how?
Well, Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere was reliably active, which you might expect, but they also showed significant activity in the right hemisphere in areas considered the right side counterparts of Wernicke's and the angular gyrus.
Wow. So the right hemisphere is really active when deaf individuals read English. That's surprising. Does it mean they're like literally seeing the words differently, maybe less phonologically?
That's a fascinating question. It suggests they might be approaching reading English in a fundamentally different way, perhaps relying more on visual spatial strategies, maybe because of their experience with sign language.
And the authors say we need to consider how they were taught English too.
Yes, they emphasize that to fully understand these activation patterns, we absolutely need to consider the specific instructional methods used.
They also share a case study, right? JH.
Oh yeah, the case study of JH is compelling. He was a deaf signer with a lesion in his right parietal lobe. He showed clear signs of visuospatial neglect, like not noticing things on his left side.
Okay, classic right parietal damage symptom.
Right. But remarkably, this neglect didn't extend to sign language stimuli. He could still see and understand signs presented in his left visual field.
Whoa. That's a really striking dissociation. His brain treated sign language differently than other visual stuff.
It seems so. Fundamentally different from other types of visual spatial information. And Berninger and Karina discuss how connectionist models, those computational network models, can offer a framework for understanding this.
Okay.
They draw a parallel to neglect dyslexia in hearing patients, where some people can still read compound words even when they neglect other parts of the page. The idea is that the way our attention interacts with linguistic representations might be different for language compared to other visual info.
So the models help think about these complex interactions, even if they aren't perfect replicas of the brain.
Exactly. They're useful heuristics, ways of thinking, even if they aren't the literal mechanisms. Which brings us to their next really important point,
Which is?
that it's currently premature. Really premature, actually, to judge the validity of cognitive theories solely on whether we can fully explain them based on our current understanding of the brain.
Ah, okay. Because our understanding of the brain is still incomplete.
Exactly. Our knowledge of the brain's intricate architecture and how it functions is still evolving rapidly. We simply don't know enough yet to definitively say a cognitive theory is right or wrong just by looking at today's brain maps.
So a theory might fit some parts of what we know, but not others.
Or, like you said, what we think we understand about the brain today could be revised tomorrow as new research comes out.
Right. They give an example of research that's valuable without brain study, don't they?
Yeah, the Morrison and colleagues example using the school cutoff method, studying the impact of schooling on cognitive development by comparing kids who just made or just missed the school entry cutoff date. No direct brain study, but still incredibly valuable research.
Tells us a lot about learning in the real world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So while brain research is crucial, it shouldn't be the only yardstick for evaluating cognitive theories, especially given the limits of our current knowledge.
Okay. And this leads into their discussion about connectionist models again, right?
Yeah.
Challenging some assumptions.
Yes. They challenge the often held assumption that these models are inherently more brain-like or automatically better at handling parallel processing compared to other kinds of cognitive models.
They mention neuroscience envy.
Yeah, citing Schneider and Graham, cautioning against uncritically accepting connectionist models just because they seem more biologically plausible. We need to be critical.
And there were early problems with those models too, like taking way longer to learn than humans.
Right, the scaling problem. Early models often needed way more learning trials than humans to master similar tasks.
And they've improved. Hybrid models.
They have. They highlight how the field has advanced, with researchers developing hybrid models that integrate instructional principles with connectionist architectures. These newer models often show more realistic learning timelines.
So there's a renewed focus on learning itself.
Definitely, both in computational models and in studying human behavior. And Berninger and Karina argue that educational psychology, with its deep understanding of learning processes, has a crucial role to play here.
That makes sense. And they also cautioned against comparing certain models unfairly, like simple connectionist ones versus big developmental theories.
Exactly. They argue it's not really a fair comparison to pit simplistic connectionist models, often designed for short-term skill learning, against broad theories like Piaget's or Vygotsky's, which cover development over much longer timescales and involve way more factors. They're just operating at different levels, asking different questions.
Got it. So finally wrapping things up, they stress the importance of brain literacy for educational psychologists.
Yes, precisely. They suggest that coursework in brain science should be an integral part of their training.
Why is that so important?
Well, having even a basic understanding of brain structure and function can significantly boost their ability to interpret neuroscientific findings and to formulate research questions that can really bridge that gap between education and neuroscience.
So it helps them collaborate better, basically.
Totally. They even recommend some accessible texts by authors like Kolb and Wishaw, McCarthy and Warrington, Lyon and Rumsey. Their core message is clear. Just as cognitive neuroscience benefited hugely from working with cognitive psychology.
It stands to gain a lot from engaging with educational psychologists who actually understand the brain.
Exactly. It's about mutual benefit.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the central message really resonates. We need this robust, two-way collaboration between educational psychology and cognitive neuroscience. It's definitely not about one field just telling the other what to do.
No, not at all. And crucially, we have to consider learning and the brain through these multiple levels of analysis to truly unravel their intricate relationship. It's complex stuff.
That's absolutely right. Educational psychology brings invaluable expertise in, higher level cognitive functions and effective teaching methods, which can really enrich cognitive neuroscience research, especially when designing and interpreting studies on learning interventions.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe ponder. Given the sheer complexity of the human brain and all these different levels we can study learning at, how might future research more creatively and effectively bridge that divide the gap between the practical wisdom of teaching and the cutting-edge discoveries of brain science? How can we use that connection to ultimately create more impactful and, personalized learning experiences for everyone? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.